All right. Um, Welcome everyone. So today, yeah, I didn't really expect to do video today. I'll be honest. Um, but since I just finished reading Julie Reshe's Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead, um, I'm going to kind of give my review of the book. It's not structured in any way. I wouldn't know where to begin to structure the book. Um, I can just say and speak broadly about the importance of Reshe's work in terms of there's a couple of points, what I would call maybe like secondary points in the book, um, that may come off as primary points. And it's not till the end of the book that you start understanding, in my opinion, the real primacy of what Julie Reshe is trying to say. So what Julie Reshe is trying to tackle in this book is she's trying to fundamentally present a new perspective, right? Um, and she's really against what you would call positive psychology. And she makes a case for how Philip Reef was right in the sense of calling uh, our modernity, our age of the psychologized being. Like we are psychologized beings now. We're psychological beings. That's easier for me to say. So we're psychological beings now, and Julie Reshe borrows that concept, that theme from Philip Reef, the sociologist. Now, of course, for her, Philip Reef is a more conservative kind of sociologist, but where he wants to emphasize going back to religion. Um, and this is where probably Julie Reshe and Philip Reef would deviate. But the main point that she's trying to get out from Philip Reef is the fact that we're psychological beings now. And she's trying to expose the sort of hegemony of the psychology, right? Positivized psychology, this sort of emphasis on happiness and how we push away pathological, what we deem as pathological, like sadness, depression, um, and so on. And she's attacking this throughout the book. Um, but not only is she attacking that, and even though that is her one of her, a lot of her main emphasis, she's trying to show how you can look at destruction and negativity as not something opposite to creativity, not something opposite to generating things. Um, and so she borrows from Catherine Malibu's concept of destructive plasticity, which is this idea that even destruction can give forms to something else, um, and you can be shaped by it. And there's conversations also with Todd McGowan and Alenka Supanchik, and really the main crux of the book is really how Julie Resh sort of kind of inverts everything into a negative. And even with the interviews, she already negativizes them, not in the interviews themselves, but in the book, they'll come up as dialogues, but they're actual YouTube uh, interviews that you could watch between all three of them. And um, so she's inverting everything. She's arguing for how you can look at gene selection or through apoptosis. With Alenka, she sort of points out how evolution doesn't have to be this thing where it's about selection. Like Julie Reshe points out how we've been emphasizing selection over variability, right? Where in Julie Reshe's opinion, actually, evolution is always a positive project because it's always like, oh, selecting for who's the most fittest. But she's like, this doesn't actually work. It's actually more about variability, mutation as such. And if we pay attention to that, we're all in some sense a kind of monster. um, but so there's a lot of you could say like a lot of side pathways that Julie Reshe kind of takes you through. She negativizes you through evolution. She negativizes you through psychology. Um, she negativizes you through some existential philosophy and psychoanalysis. She's radically negativizing all those fields of study and so on. And so the book is pretty comprehensive, despite how short it is. It's pretty comprehensive or broad. Maybe broad would be the better term. She's more broad in kind of showing all the negativity you can find in these concepts and fields of study. I will say, if I didn't finish reading the book, I would have really had a bad misconception. Because towards the end, she addresses basically in her own way, she addresses what she would consider as misinterpretations or misapplications of her concept. So again, just to kind of like summarize the basic premise, for Julie Reshe, the death drive is what fundamentally alienates us and also helps us commune together. So it's the fact that, and this was a brilliant part of her talk with Todd McGowan, is that fundamentally we can't say that the individual or society comes first or latter. Honestly, they emerge simultaneously, and the reason why there is a social and an individual is because they're both the failures of the other, and they basically co-emerge. And so this is kind of like proving the point of how the death drive is also, and she thanks Todd McGowan for basically putting the death drive into the more social, political sphere, because fundamentally with Freud it was always individual. So she accepts that, and she also accepts some of Catherine Malibu's destructive plasticity. Of course, for Catherine Malibu's concept of destruction plasticity, it was only meant for specific subjects that could not actually return. So, for example, if your mother had Alzheimer's and that radically changed her personality, Catherine Malibu's concept would be like, look, this is destructive plasticity taking form. But for Julie Reshe, she disagrees. She doesn't think, she actually tries to take Catherine Malibu's concept of destructive plasticity and sort of universally apply it to everybody. We all experience destructive plasticity. So yeah, there is something really interesting about Julie Reshe's work. But again, all of those things were super fascinating, right? To read about, evolution and how, evolution, people that are evolutionists or Darwins, they only emphasize selection rather than variability, and so on. And how just most of our fields of knowledge sort of just always put into second place destruction, disease, deprecation. It's always secondary. And again, Julie Reshe really inverts all that. But I think if you get caught up in that, like I did for a little bit, then it's possible that you might miss a more important pivotal point that is not quite exactly in the book. and 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 you could say that in some sense Julie Reshe failed to express this, but fundamentally it kind of has to fail, because if it succeeds, then it's not what she's advocating for. Um, but so how are we understanding this negativity in a real sense? And I think she does accept Zizek's absolute recoil, if I remember correctly. But there is something fundamental. It's important to know this with Julie Reshe in the book, that she's actually advocating for a kind of core that cannot be that is non-dialectible. It has no dialectic. Basically, it's this core of negativity, or maybe you could say absolute negativity, is the very foundation for dialectics to occur. Um, and it took me a while to really understand, um, in a visceral way, what she actually means. But I didn't understand this until the end of the book, mainly because, again, she addresses some possible misconceptions. And one of the crazy ones was when she starts talking about, like, okay, so if you read my book, there's that risk of you, trying to apply it and trying to live in a certain way now. And she basically borrows a lot of her premises in the beginning of the book and throughout the most of the book, and places them towards the end, and then basically says, uh, if you apply it, my premises, um, you still don't get it, essentially. And I was a little bit like shocked at what she was getting at, because again, she's not explicitly saying this. She's just telling you that you don't get it, basically, um, in her own way. Of course, she doesn't explicitly say you don't get it, but in a very roundabout way, she basically says you don't get it if you think you can just apply my concepts. So what she's getting at, and I guess the best way I can express this is by giving an example. Um, for a while when I was reading the book, I was like, okay, so what's the difference between like nihilism and what Julie Reshe is talking about? Because there does seem to be some real tangible elements to this. But actually, no. What Julie Reshe is trying to show you is that we can turn anything negative positive. And because we can do this, and she even makes a really good point and about why it's so difficult to understand how basically everything negative goes positive as well, is that fundamentally thinking and language are just fundamentally positive. And so it makes it really difficult to understand the core negativity that Julie Reshe is talking about. Um, But again, the example of, for example, if a guy accepts nihilism as a kind of truth, um, then what's happening is Julie Reshe would actually say that even though he's correct in that everything's meaningless and everything's pointless and everything's purposeless, um, because he's accepted it and he's sort of living his nihilism, um, this negativity is no longer an antagonism to the subject. And so, even though it's pessimistic, you could argue, and it is negative, fundamentally it becomes positive again, just because what we keep doing is we keep stripping away the the antagonism of the negative. And so even if you read this book and you accept everything Julie Reshe says, in some sense, you don't actually get it, because what you're doing is the very thing she told you not to do, which is to not strip away the antagonism. And if you just accept it, if you accept everything, like, just you have this risk of taking away the antagonism. And one of the last couple chapters towards the end, there's a dialogue with her and Alenka Supanchik, and Alenka says for her the death drive is something like similar to primary repression, but the death drive is a primary antagonism. And I think once you understand that the death drive is a primary antagonism, then we have to understand the risk of the way that we talk about the negative and the way that we talk about the positive. It's very easy to kind of point out the fallacies of the positive, from coming from the negative, but I think it's much more difficult. And Julie Reshe doesn't actually talk about this too much, but it's much more difficult to point out the positive in the negative, because if you point out the positive in the negative, then you're not really at that core of negativity. And that's what she's trying to show you. That means if you do find the positive in the negative, then that's not it. That's not the core of negativity that she's talking about. But it does expose how quickly the negative becomes positive. And so I think if we were to really understand her work, is to really understand that this notion of negative is so of the death drive. I'll just call it death drive. The notion of this death drive is so difficult to talk about, so difficult to express, because even as I'm speaking, even as I'm thinking, all of these movements, Julie Reshe would call is positive movements. So I have this tendency to reduce and simplify and strip away the antagonism. So that's what's difficult about expressing and understanding Julie Reshe's work, in my opinion, is that she's not going to explicitly tell you that there's a sort of paradox of negativity. And the paradox of negativity is, it's an invisible one, that it's not the fact that, oh, there's always this dialectic of positive and negative. No, it's that it's so difficult to bear a true negative. And it's because we always have this tendency to take negative and turn it positive, right? Or find the positive in the negative. Either way you do it, we still have a tendency to do that. And so the way that I kind of understand Julie Reshe now is that she's trying to advocate for, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think she's trying to advocate for this awareness of this. She's trying to advocate for this awareness of a negativity that cannot be in the dialect, right? That cannot be dialectable. It's non-dialectical, right? So there is no dialectic for this kind of core negativity. And I think the only way to keep a kind of awareness of this negativity is not so much about accepting it. It's not so much as practicing it, because that's kind of like a contradiction. And she talks about, negative practice being sort of contradictive in terms, but the practice is simply, you could say, embracing the primary antagonism, right? Letting the primary antagonism be. Maybe I'd rather say letting the primary antagonism be, because if I say embracing the primary antagonism, because if you embrace it, then you risk, it's a contradiction. Like you risk eradicating the primary antagonism by embracing it. So that's the trouble with thinking through this sort of core negativity that Julie Reshe is talking about, because we can't just embrace negativity, because that's a contradiction. Like the moment you do that, you turn it into a positive, right? And so you can tell that embracing negativity is not the answer either, necessarily, because you risk eradicating the antagonism that was negative in the first place. So that's what you need to see, um, and that's what I think Julie Reshe is trying to point out, is that the moment you accept this negative, the moment you embrace this negative, you already eradicate the primary antagonism of the negative, and therefore it's positive. But her transition of thought is not so you can get to that point where you embrace the negative and then it becomes positive. No, she's talking about embracing the negative is actually keeping it as a primary antagonism, which means that fundamentally you can't embrace it. It's impossible to embrace the negative in some sense, because if you do, the risk is the same, that you risk eradicating the actual antagonism that makes it negative in the first place. And this is what makes it so difficult to talk about it, to speak about it, to think through it, because fundamentally language and thinking all have these attributes of eradicating what Alenka Supanchik would call the primary antagonism. This is the death drive, the primary antagonism. So the only thing that you can do, which is really already a positive, right? A positive kind of behavior. The only thing you can do, at least it seems from Julie Reshe's point of view, is simply just endure it. It has nothing to do with you accepting it, with you not accepting it. It's about sort of just brutally enduring it alone and enduring it together. And there's nothing really positive about that, because if you say it's positive, then again, what you're doing is you're stripping away the antagonism of it. And you're in some sense diminishing the actual suffering of it. Because then what you're doing is you're making it useful now. You're right. You're saying like, oh, this is a concept that can bring us together, that can save us, that can give us closer. No, that's the moment you do that, you're stripping away the antagonism. And that's what's so difficult, thinking about this negative, that Julie Reshe is pointing out to us. That I think what we've done is we've become so comfortable with a kind of Hegelian dialectic that's like, oh yeah, and then it becomes positive, and then this, cancels out back into the universal and blah 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 blah. But actually, yeah, that's that I think we've gotten really comfortable with how things kind of fluctuate between positive, negative. And I don't think we've really thought about how the antagonism itself, the really core antagonism is there, that we always cover over. And that's why I think she even agreed with Zizek about absolute recoil. And I think there is kind of like that undialectable, there's this sort of non-dialectic, in the core of what Julie Reshe is trying to say. But yeah, if I were to give another example, it's kind of like I remember when I was practicing Buddhism for a while, and one of the teachers says, the reason why we do meditation is for nothing. And I remember I could never accept that. Like that was a constant antagonism for me. But you see, what Julie Reshe would point out is that actually, if you do accept it, right? So there's like two ways that there's two ways we could fail here, right? Because fundamentally it's about failure. But there's two ways that we can fool ourselves into succeeding, right? One way we could fool ourselves into succeeding is by thinking that there's actually something useful or a benefit that can be gained from this meditation, right? That's one. That's typically the positive. That's the more manifest positive, right? The manifest negative would be the person accepting that we do this meditation for nothing. But you see, the moment you accept that we do this meditation for nothing, you've stripped away the antagonism of that nothing. And so now it's no longer nothing, it's something. And so, and so once again, it's positive. And this is why towards the end of the book, Julie Reshe talks about how we need to be guardians of basically the negative. And I think being guardians of that, it translates to me in terms of being sort of aware of the fact that you're almost like being hyper aware of the fact that everything is in a dialectic between opposite and negative. But then there's another awareness where you also realize the foundational core of the dialectic, which is non-dialectical, and it's that core negativity. And I think fundamentally, I think that's all that she's saying in the end, right? Because she even ends it with, there's no salvation, there's no hope, there's no nothing. We're all just monstrous creatures, just bearing our opening our black hearts to each other. So it's sort of very poetic kind of thing. But I think she's sort of just keeping it, keeping a kind of awareness of that. And obviously that's why doing something rather than being aware is doing something sort of cancels it out. You can't be like, oh yeah, I'm practicing my core negativity. Like that's just not, because the moment you do that, like you're just literally actively trying to strip away the primary antagonism of life. So yeah, something super fundamentally, something super fundamentally negative there. I'm still debating whether it's a book that I want to read again. I think there's a couple of chapters worth reading again. But right now I have to see. I think I'm only slightly against reading again, mainly because I know I have so many other things to read and I don't want to be like, so yeah, I think that's probably why. But I have to say, just overall, I love the book. I can't say that I love the book. I would recommend it to anyone, but I also know at the same time, this book is kind of like a very selective, it's probably very selective for a group of people, because I would say that if you've predicated yourself on like positive thinking for a long time, this book is going to be a real shakeup. But if you are generally skeptical and embrace the more negative position like existentialist, or if you're already into psychoanalysis, then I think this book is much easier to swallow. But overall, I think Julie Reshe did a really good job. I don't think I could say you don't really need to come in knowing, in my opinion, like you don't really need to come in knowing too much about psychoanalysis. There's kind of like a lot of like historical recap on the book. And then of course you have a lot of interviews with, some of our top modern psychoanalysts, right? Philosophers, right? Todd McGowan, Catherine Malibu, Alenka Supanchik, Julie Reshe is engaging with all of these three figures. There's even some parts in there where, Zizek is kind of name dropped, and absolute recoil as a concept is also name dropped. And Julie Reshe is connecting those concepts. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I love the book. I would probably read it again. Maybe even in a group setting, I would read it again. There's definitely a lot of discussion worth having in this. I think if there's anything important that I took out of this book is simply the paradox of negativity, the sort of perhaps futile paradox of negativity, which may make it very difficult for people to understand and grasp. And I think, even saying things like the world is meaningless, pointless, purposeless, the moment you accept that, you console yourself, that you make that a sort of consoling thing for you. And the moment you make that negative a kind of consoling thing for you, you've already made it positive. And so that's what Julie Reshe is also trying to expose, that actually we need to be guardians of this negativity. And so that kind of brings out a kind of awareness that we're probably not typically used to. I would say most of us thinkers are probably pretty aware of the sort of dialectics that go on between positive and negative, and opposites and so on, but it's totally different ball game thinking that I have to also be aware of this dialectics and then also be aware of this sort of non-dialectical foundation, um, where if I try to do anything, if I try to, if I try to do anything, if I try to incorporate it in my life, I've already stripped it of its antagonism. And that is the paradox of this death drive and everything else. So yeah, there's a lot there. But anyways, I really enjoyed the book. I hope you guys, in fact, I hate advertising like this, but the book is stupid expensive. So if you just I think my email is linked in here somewhere. But yeah, if you guys just email me or message me, and then, I can probably get your email. Totally happy to send the PDF if you guys want to read it, because it's a stupid expensive book. And on top of that, I have the PDF, got it through my university. So if you guys want it, totally happy to send it over to you guys, because I think it's a book worth reading. And we're talking about, I think, if I'm being honest, I think it's definitely a book that has completely changed my thinking. I don't think I can go back after Julie Reshe. I don't think. I think I'm like Kant now. I've been wakened from my slumber. So yeah, I think both Buber and Julie Reshe are like two thinkers that I just can't go back after reading them. And I think, yeah, Julie Reshe is definitely one of those now. I just can't go back after reading her. It was just so viscerally effective to me. But to me, those are the best kind of books, right? So, anyways, yeah, that's it. I definitely talked longer than I expected, but hope you guys enjoy it. All right, take care, guys.